Welcome to Chapter 16 of Pax. That's enough. The words, along with Bola's hand on Peter's shoulder, were a welcome relief. His foot throbbed, his shoulders ached, and his armpits were so chafed that they were bleeding. 2 days of boot camp Vola, the secret name he christened the torture sessions, in which he crutched uphill, dragged himself over stony ground on his elbows, and pitched mountains of hay balanced on one foot, had worn him out. He swung around to face the cabin, suddenly not sure he could even make it that far. But above the roof of the cabin, the hills were veiled with rain clouds. Night was coming, and he thought of Pax, wet and cold. I should keep going. No, you will undo that good if you push too fast. Peter nodded and took a step toward the cabin, but Vola shook her head. Not yet. She pointed to the barn, the third condition. The barn seemed impossibly far away. Peter looked back at the cabin. He wanted to fall into that hammock. He planted his crutch tips in a deliberate show. What is it? Nothing much. You're going to work some puppets for me. Marionettes. That sound too hard? Marionettes? I don't get it. You know what they are? Sure. He pictured the only ones he'd seen up close. Punch and Judy characters with long chins and sharp noses at a street fair when he'd been a little kid. Dead-eyed and skeletony as starving rats. The puppeteer had jerked them across the stage in twitchy rushes that had left him with nightmares for weeks. What about them? Vola eyed him for a moment before answering. Another true piece of myself I recovered. I remembered that when I made marionettes for my little nieces when I was a teenager, I remembered how much I loved carving the wood. She pulled 2 scarves from her overalls and handed them over with a sigh. Wrap those hand grips. You're still hanging off the crutches. Take the weight on your palms, child. Spread it to your arms, even when you're just standing there. Vola's unexpected kindness undid Peter. 1 minute she'd be barking at him for a dozen pull-ups or shooting her fingers at his face, warning him not to get too close. It was comfortable that way, like home. But the next minute she'd rub her salve into his aching shoulders, or sand the splinters off his crutches, or drop her chores to mix him a mug of hot chocolate. And he'd realize how much care she was putting into making him strong and mobile, and he felt guilty. He felt guilty now, winding the soft cloth around the hand grips, so he told her what he figured she wanted to hear. Your nieces must have been really happy to get such great presents, but he doubted it. Those nieces of hers probably stuffed those rat skeletony dead-eyed puppets right into the trash the first night they'd gotten them. No bad dreams. Vola shrugged, but Peter could tell she was secretly pleased by his words, and his guilt eased. He arranged his weight on his palms and followed her to the barn. In the doorway she paused to draw in the cool air. It smelled of wood and hay and linseed and varnish, all good scents, Peter thought, separating them out, and really good together. He swung inside. Vola crossed to the opposite wall, the one draped in burlap. Peter hung back. That wall had unnerved him the first day. She pulled the material aside, and he nearly lost his balance, as though what he saw had hit him with physical force. The puppets, marionettes, he could see now that they were marionettes hanging off the wall. They were spookily realistic, and yet like nothing he'd ever seen. He stepped closer and found his voice. Their eyes. My grandmother's jewelry. She had long jet necklaces. The pupils are filled with those beads. They flash in the light, and they make my friends seem alive. Peter felt silent again, and Vola didn't disturb him as he studied the creatures hanging in front of him. 5 are human, a king and a queen, a child, a pirate or sailor, and a sorceress. The rest animals. All the heads are wooden, nearly human size, and huge-eyed, but the bodies were a wild variety of materials. A tortoise was shelled with a green and orange gourd. Pinecone bracts formed a serpent's scales, and feathers. Almost all the puppets wore an assortment of feathers as hair or headdresses or cloaks or breeches. Looped neatly over pegs beside each marionette was an array of dowels and paddles, strung together with a thin black cord. In the center of the wall hung what Peter guessed was the largest puppet, covered by a separate piece of cloth. Vola removed it, and he gasped. The great bird's wings were magnificent, probably a good 5 feet at full span. Hundreds of dark feathers gracefully overlapped each other in perfect rows, the tips painted red as if licked with fire. Vola lifted it from its perch and carried it over to Peter. Most of the others are head and shoulder puppets, but this one needs to fly. I jointed him at the elbow, and when he soars, you can almost feel the wind. Go ahead, you can touch him. Peter reached out. His fingertips stroked a sleek, feathered shoulder. Then the sharp wooden beak painted a bright gold. The bird's eyes glittered huge and black. He dropped his hands. So what do I have to do with this? Vola motioned to the hay bales. May as well sit down. I'm going to begin at the beginning. Peter sank into a bale of hay, grateful for the rest. He watched as Vola hung the great bird back up. She pulled a small book from a niche in the wall, and then came and sat beside Peter and cradled it in her hands. I killed someone. She looked up. Peter wasn't quick enough to cover his shock. She heaved a sigh thick with disgust. No matter what Diableman lines they feed you about learning trades and reaching your potential, you're there to kill people. Kill or be killed. That's the contract in war. That wasn't true. His father, for example. You won't be fighting, right? Peter had pressed. His father had laughed and said no, he'd be doing what he was pretty much doing as a civilian, laying wires. Peter didn't bother correcting Vola, though, because the look on her face was so wrecked. You killed someone. I probably killed a lot of people, or at least contributed to their deaths, but this one I saw. After. I had to search his body. We were trained to look for weapons, anything we could use. I dropped to my knees and I had to touch him, looking for those weapons. I remember being shocked at the feel of him. I was a medic, but I half expected him to be plastic, not real. The way they taught us to think of the enemy was in our training. But of course he was. He was warm. It was cold out and he was giving off warmth, as if his life was steaming out of him, and I was touching him without his permission. I'd murdered him, but what bothered me was that he had lost the right to say yes or no about what happened to him. You probably think that's crazy, don't you? Peter's mouth had gone dry. He didn't know what to say, and then suddenly he thought of the kind-eyed therapist, and he didn't know. That must have been hard for you. Vola looked at him with a surprised relief on her face. She nodded. Suddenly, I was desperate to know who he was, where he'd come from, what he cared about, who loved him. His mouth was open, as if he might have been wanting to speak to me. I realized something then, that even though he was a man, even though he was a different race, even though he had grown up in a different country, we might have a lot in common. Important things, more important than which army had drafted us. Two, but not two. But I'd killed him. So now we'll never know. I searched his body, not for weapons, but for clues as to who he'd been. Vola went silent, her face so devastated that Peter wanted to look away. And this. Vola lifted the book, The 7 Voyages of Sinbad, part of the Arabian Nights series, in his pocket. He carried it into war, so it had to have meant something. An old copy, so probably had been his favorite as a boy. Sinbad was brave, so maybe he thought it brought him courage, or maybe he just wanted to remember that once he had been a little boy and he had read books and felt safe. A page was bookmarked. The story of how Sinbad escapes from the rock's nest. I figured that story helped him believe that one day he'd escape too, and get back home. Vola rose. She lifted the great-winged puppet off the wall again. The rook. This bird could snatch up elephants in its talons. Look at it. She carried the bird back to Peter and turned its beak to face him. Its gaze was so fierce that Peter shrank back. What do I have to do with this? He asked again. That book was so important to that soldier that he'd carried it to war. I figured since I'd taken his life, I owed him something. I owed it to him to tell the story that meant so much to him. I carved all these puppets, and I've been telling the story of Sinbad escaping from the rock here in my barn for nearly 20 years. Lola handed the control apparatus to Peter. And now I'm going to see what it looks like. See you guys in chapter 17.